A millionaire is diagnosed with a terminal illness and asks his maid to spend one night with him. She, surprised, agrees, knowing he's asking for something much deeper than just a physical desire. If this story caught your interest, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. Stay tuned. The Boston skyline glistened in the morning sun as Maxwell Bennett stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office. 58 floors above the hustle of the financial district, he surveyed the city like a king overlooking his kingdom. At 53, Maxwell had built Bennett Enterprises into one of the most successful investment firms on the East Coast. His name appeared regularly in Fortune magazine, and his influence stretched from Wall Street to Washington. "Mr. Bennett, your 9 o'clock is here," his assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "Send them in," Maxwell replied without turning from the window. He straightened his custom Italian suit and prepared the expression he'd perfected over decades. Confidence mixed with just enough approachability to put people at ease while maintaining his authority. The meeting was like countless others. Ambitious entrepreneurs seeking his investment, hanging on his every word, laughing at his mildest attempts at humor. Maxwell played his role flawlessly, asking pointed questions that revealed he'd already scrutinized their business plan thoroughly. By the time they left, he'd secured another potentially lucrative deal, and they departed with the validation of having impressed Maxwell Bennett. Alone again, he loosened his tie and poured himself a glass of 25-year-old scotch, despite the early hour. The burning sensation as it slid down his throat was one of the few things that still felt real to him these days. His phone buzzed. A text from his son, Connor. "Dad, can we reschedule dinner tonight? Something came up at work." Maxwell stared at the message. This was the third cancellation in a month. He typed a brief "of course" and set the phone down, unsurprised yet somehow still disappointed. At what point had his relationships become mere appointments on a calendar? When had the connection with his only child grown so tenuous? Later that afternoon, as Maxwell's driver navigated through the Boston traffic toward his Beacon Hill mansion, he barely registered the opulence that surrounded him. The hand-stitched leather seats of his Bentley, the respectful nod from the security guard at his gated community, the immaculate landscaping of his 3-acre property. "Will you need me tomorrow morning, sir?" asked Richard, his driver of 15 years. "The usual time," Maxwell answered, his mind already elsewhere. The massive front door closed behind him with a heavy thud, and silence enveloped him. His footsteps echoed through the marble foyer as he entered the sprawling residence, all 15,000 square feet of it, filled with expensive art, antique furniture, and not a single sign of being lived in beyond Maxwell's own presence. "Good evening, Mr. Bennett." The quiet voice startled him. Eleanor Parker, his housekeeper for the past 6 years, stood in the hallway leading to the kitchen. At 38, she maintained a professional demeanor that kept a respectful distance between them. Her brown hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and her uniform was pressed and spotless as always. "Eleanor, I thought you'd be gone by now," Maxwell said, checking his watch. "I was just finishing up. There's dinner in the warming drawer if you're hungry." Maxwell nodded, realizing he hadn't eaten since morning. "Thank you." Eleanor gathered her things, preparing to leave. Something about her quiet efficiency had always struck Maxwell as dignified. Unlike many of his employees who seemed either intimidated by him or eager to impress, Eleanor simply did her job with remarkable consistency. "How's your mother doing?" Maxwell asked suddenly, surprising himself with the question. Eleanor's mother had been ill. He remembered signing off on some additional time off for her a few months ago. Eleanor paused, seemingly just as surprised by his inquiry. "She's better. Thank you for asking. The new treatment seems to be helping." "Good. That's good to hear." An awkward silence hung between them. Maxwell rarely engaged in personal conversations with his staff. He prided himself on being a fair employer who paid well above market rate, but he maintained strict boundaries. He couldn't remember the last time he'd asked Eleanor anything about her life outside of his home. "Well, good night, Mr. Bennett," she said finally, moving toward the door. "Good night, Eleanor." After she left, Maxwell wandered into his state-of-the-art kitchen. He opened the warming drawer to find a perfectly prepared salmon fillet with roasted vegetables and quinoa. Eleanor knew his preferences. Simple, healthy meals that required minimal effort from him. He carried the plate to his dining table, designed to seat 16 but where he always ate alone, and pulled out his phone to check his emails. As he scrolled through countless messages, a nagging headache began to form behind his right eye. He'd been experiencing these more frequently lately, along with occasional dizzy spells he attributed to stress. Running an empire was no small feat, after all. The following morning, Maxwell woke to find the headache had intensified. A wave of dizziness hit him as he stood from his bed, forcing him to grip the nightstand for support. When his vision finally cleared, he decided to call his private physician. Dr. Landon Harrison had been Maxwell's doctor for over a decade, catering to his preference for discretion and efficiency. When Maxwell described his symptoms, Dr. Harrison insisted on seeing him immediately. "I've got meetings all day," Maxwell protested. "Cancel them," Dr. Harrison replied with uncharacteristic firmness. "This isn't something we should delay, Max." The examination was thorough. Blood tests, neurological evaluations, and finally an MRI. Maxwell sat impatiently in Dr. Harrison's office afterward, answering emails on his phone while waiting for what he assumed would be a prescription for migraines and advice to reduce stress. When Dr. Harrison finally entered, the grave expression on his face caused Maxwell to set his phone down. "What is it?" Maxwell asked, his businessman's instinct immediately recognizing bad news. "The MRI showed a mass in your brain, Maxwell. Given its location and appearance, we need to do a biopsy immediately to confirm, but—" Maxwell felt a coldness spread through his chest. "But what?" "It has characteristics consistent with a highly aggressive glioblastoma." The doctor continued speaking, but Maxwell heard only fragments. Advanced, treatment options, specialist, time frame. The words swirled around him without fully penetrating. "How long?" Maxwell interrupted. Dr. Harrison hesitated. "Without treatment, perhaps 3 to 4 months. With aggressive intervention, possibly a year, though that's optimistic given the location and apparent progression." Maxwell stared out the window behind Dr. Harrison's desk. Outside, people walked along the sidewalk, going about their daily lives, completely unaware that Maxwell Bennett's world had just collapsed. "I want this kept completely confidential," he said finally, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "No one is to know about this. No one. Max, you'll need support." "I said no one," Maxwell repeated firmly. "I'll consider the treatment options, but this stays between us." As Maxwell left the clinic through a private exit to avoid being seen, he instructed his driver to take him home rather than back to the office. For the first time in decades, Maxwell Bennett was going to take an unplanned day off work. In his home office, Maxwell stared at the wall of achievements that chronicled his life. Framed magazine covers featuring his success stories, photographs with politicians and celebrities, awards from business associations and charitable organizations he supported primarily for the tax benefits, 1 year, possibly less. He thought of his ex-wife, Victoria, living in Europe with her new husband. Their divorce 15 years ago had been amicable in the way that extremely expensive divorces between wealthy people can be, mutually dissatisfying, but ultimately pragmatic. He thought of Connor, his son who had followed in his footsteps to become a finance executive, but who seemed to have inherited Maxwell's workaholic tendencies without the drive that made Maxwell exceptional. As the reality of his diagnosis sank in, Maxwell realized the crushing truth. He had accumulated more wealth than he could spend in 10 lifetimes, yet there was no one in his life who truly knew him, no one whose primary connection to him wasn't financial or professional. He poured himself another scotch and moved to the window, watching as Eleanor's car pulled into the driveway. She arrived precisely on schedule, as she always did. Maxwell observed her as she gathered her things from the passenger seat, her movements efficient and purposeful. For 6 years, she had moved through his home, maintaining order in his life with a quiet dignity that he had barely acknowledged. Now, as Maxwell faced his own mortality, he found himself wondering about the woman who knew more about his daily habits than anyone else in the world. The splitting headache returned, a stark reminder of what was growing inside his brain. Maxwell closed his eyes against the pain, against the realization that time, the one resource he had always controlled through meticulous scheduling and delegation, was now the one thing his wealth couldn't buy more of. The following weeks passed in a blur for Maxwell. He attended meetings, made decisions, and maintained the appearance of normalcy while secretly beginning treatment. The radiation made him nauseous, and the medication left him foggy, but he refused to show any sign of weakness at Bennett Enterprises. He'd built his reputation on being indomitable. He wouldn't let that image crumble now. Eleanor noticed the changes despite his efforts to hide them. The untouched meals she prepared, the increasingly frequent afternoons when he returned home early, the prescription bottles he thought he'd hidden in his bathroom cabinet when she cleaned. But she said nothing, respecting the boundary that had always existed between them. One evening, Maxwell arrived home to find Eleanor still there, later than usual. She was arranging fresh flowers in the living room. White lilies his favorite, though he couldn't remember ever telling her that. "You're working late," he remarked, setting down his briefcase. "I'm sorry if I'm intruding," she responded. "I noticed you haven't been eating much lately, so I prepared some bone broth. It might be easier on your stomach than a full meal." Maxwell stared at her, momentarily speechless. How had she known? Had his doctor broken confidentiality? Reading his expression, Eleanor quickly added, "My mother went through something similar. With her treatments, the side effects can be difficult." "I don't know what you're talking about," Maxwell said stiffly. Eleanor met his gaze directly for perhaps the first time in 6 years. "Mr. Bennett, I don't mean to overstep, but I've been managing your home for a long time. I notice things. I haven't said anything to anyone, and I won't." The silence between them stretched uncomfortably until Maxwell's shoulders sagged slightly. "The bone broth, that was thoughtful, thank you." Eleanor nodded and returned to arranging the flowers. Maxwell watched her hands move methodically among the stems, precise yet gentle. For years, these small acts of consideration had blended into the background of his life, unnoticed and unacknowledged. "How did you know about the lilies?" he asked. 3 years ago, you received a bouquet of them from a business associate. You mentioned they were the only flowers you actually liked." She glanced up. "You seemed surprised I remembered." "I'm surprised I told you at all," Maxwell admitted. "You weren't telling me exactly. You were on the phone with someone else. I just happened to be in the room." Something about this exchange shifted the air between them. For the first time, Maxwell saw Eleanor not just as his housekeeper, but as someone who had been witnessing his life up close for years, observing details he himself had forgotten. That night, Maxwell couldn't sleep. The headache was back, a constant reminder of what was growing inside him. He wandered downstairs to his study, where he kept his most expensive scotch. As he poured a glass, he noticed a small handwritten note next to a glass container of the bone broth. "Heat gently. Small, Zebsimankie." He ignored the scotch and instead warmed the broth as instructed. To his surprise, it was the first thing that had tasted good to him in weeks, and it settled his stomach almost immediately. The next morning, Eleanor found the empty container washed and dried on the counter. Next to it was a note in Maxwell's precise handwriting. "It helped. Thank you." It was a small exchange, insignificant in the grand scheme of things, but it marked the beginning of a subtle shift in their dynamic. Maxwell began to notice Eleanor more, not just her presence, but the thoughtfulness behind her actions. How she'd rearranged his medication by the time of day it needed to be taken. How she'd placed a comfortable chair in the bathroom after, noticing he needed to sit down sometimes while brushing his teeth. How she'd started leaving ginger tea on his nightstand in the evenings. 2 weeks later, Maxwell had a particularly brutal day of treatments. He'd insisted on going alone, maintaining the fiction that he was attending business meetings. By the time he returned home, he could barely make it through the door before a wave of nausea and dizziness overwhelmed him. Eleanor found him leaning against the wall in the foyer, pale and sweating. Without hesitation, she slipped her arm around his waist and helped him to the nearest sofa. "I'll get your medication," she said, but Maxwell caught her wrist. "Stay," he managed to say. "Just for a minute." She sat beside him, a respectable distance away, but close enough that he felt less alone as he waited for the worst of the dizziness to pass. "I never asked," Maxwell said finally, his voice hoarse, "about your life before you came to work for me." Eleanor seemed surprised by the question. "There's not much to tell. I grew up in Vermont. My father was a high school teacher, my mother a nurse. I moved to Boston for college but had to drop out when my father became ill. I needed to work." "What did you study?" "Literature. I wanted to be a professor someday." Maxwell tried to imagine Eleanor in a lecture hall, sharing her passion for books with eager students, a completely different life from the one where she managed his household. "Needs. Do you regret it? Not finishing?" Eleanor considered the question thoughtfully. "I regret the circumstances, not the choice. Family comes first, and I've been fortunate to have stable employment." Maxwell nodded, suddenly aware of how little he knew about his own employees' lives and dreams. "And now your mother is ill." "Yes, breast cancer. She's responding well to treatment, but it's been difficult." Another silence fell between them, but this one felt different, not awkward but contemplative. "I should get your medication," Eleanor said finally, standing. "Eleanor," Maxwell called as she reached the doorway. "Thank you, not just for today, but for everything you do around here. I've never properly acknowledged it." She gave him a small smile. "You're welcome, Mr. Bennett." The following Sunday, Eleanor was surprised to receive a call from Maxwell. She didn't typically work weekends, and he had never called her directly before. "I'm sorry to bother you on your day off," he began, his voice more hesitant than she had ever heard it. "I was wondering if you might come by the house today. There's something I'd like to discuss. I can arrange for a car if that helps." Eleanor agreed, curiosity overcoming her surprise. When she arrived, she found Maxwell in the garden pavilion rather than his study where he normally conducted business. He wore casual clothes, a simple sweater and slacks rather than his usual suit, and looked somehow smaller, more human. "Please, sit," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Our tea service was laid out between them. "I hope I didn't interrupt anything important." "Just Sunday dinner preparations for my mother," Eleanor replied. "My sister is with her today." Maxwell nodded, seemingly unsure how to continue. Finally, he said, "I've been thinking about what you said about your education, about wanting to be a professor." Eleanor waited, unsure where this was going. "I've set up a foundation," Maxwell continued, "the Eleanor Parker Educational Trust. It's fully funded and will provide scholarships for students in financial need, with preference given to those studying literature. And," he hesitated, "it includes provisions for you to complete your degree should you wish to do so." Eleanor stared at him, stunned. "Mr. Bennett, I don't know what to say. That's incredibly generous, but—" "It's already done," Maxwell interrupted gently. "Whether you choose to use the provision for yourself or not, the foundation will continue its work." "May I ask why?" Eleanor's voice was barely above a whisper. Maxwell looked out at the garden, blooming with early summer flowers. "I've spent my life acquiring things, Eleanor. Buildings, companies, art, things that seemed important at the time. Now I find myself wondering what any of it was for." He met her gaze directly. "You gave up your dreams to care for your family. It seemed right to give those dreams back to you and to extend that opportunity to others." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you. I don't know how else to respond except to say thank you." Maxwell nodded, uncomfortable with her emotion, but also moved by it. "There's something else I wanted to discuss. As my condition progresses, I'll need more assistance, the kind that goes beyond your current responsibilities. I'd like to hire additional help, but I'd also like to offer you a different position, if you're interested." "What kind of position?" "My personal assistant, both at home and at the office. The salary would be substantially increased, of course, and you'd have more regular hours." "I trust you, Eleanor. More importantly, you already know about my health." The offer surprised her almost as much as the foundation. "I don't have any experience in business," she pointed out. "You have experience with me," Maxwell replied simply. That's more valuable right now. Eleanor considered it. May I think about it? Of course, take all the time you need. As Eleanor drove home that evening, her mind spun with Maxwell's unexpected generosity and offer. The man she had worked for all these years, distant, demanding, occasionally intimidating, was showing a side of himself she had only glimpsed in rare, unguarded moments. What had prompted this change? Was it merely his illness making him sentimental, or was it something more, and why her specifically? She had always done her job well, but she had never expected to be noticed, let alone rewarded so extravagantly. Meanwhile, back at the mansion, Maxwell sat alone in his study, contemplating the strange relief he felt after speaking with Eleanor. For the first time since his diagnosis, he had taken an action that wasn't about his legacy in business terms, but about making a tangible difference in someone's life. The warmth in Eleanor's eyes when she thanked him had affected him more deeply than he could have anticipated. His phone buzzed with a text from Connor. Sorry I missed your call earlier, what's up? Maxwell looked at the message from his son, whom he hadn't seen in over a month, despite multiple attempts to arrange dinner. He thought about telling Connor about his diagnosis, about the treatments, about his fears. Instead, he simply replied, Nothing urgent. Let's try for dinner this week. As he set the phone down, Maxwell realized with a startling clarity that, while he had spent his life accumulating power and wealth, he had failed to cultivate the connections that might have made that wealth meaningful. Now facing his own fragility, he was beginning to understand what true value might look like. And somehow, improbably, it was his housekeeper, a woman who had moved silently through his home for years, who was showing him the way. Summer faded into autumn, and Maxwell's condition deteriorated faster than his doctors had predicted. The aggressive treatment protocol had bought him time, but at a considerable cost. His once commanding presence had diminished, he'd lost weight, and his hair had thinned dramatically. Yet he refused to step back from running Bennett Enterprises, instead relying increasingly on Eleanor, who had accepted his offer to become his personal assistant. Eleanor quickly proved herself invaluable in her new role. She learned the rhythms of Maxwell's business with remarkable speed, anticipating his needs before he expressed them. She rearranged his schedule around his treatments without anyone at the company suspecting why, fielded calls when he was too exhausted to speak, and took meticulous notes during meetings when his focus wavered. More importantly, she became the guardian of his secret. Only Dr. Harrison and Eleanor knew the full extent of Maxwell's illness. Not even Connor was aware of his father's condition, a fact that Eleanor questioned, but never challenged outright. "Your son called again," Eleanor informed Maxwell one afternoon as she brought his medication to his home office. "He wants to know if you're available for dinner tomorrow." Maxwell sighed, rubbing his temples. The headaches were constant now. "Tell him I have a business engagement." Eleanor set down the tray with his pills and water. That would be the third cancellation. "This month?" Something in her tone made Maxwell look up. "Are you questioning my decision?" "No," she replied evenly. "I'm observing a pattern." Maxwell's instinct was to bristle at her directness, but he found he lacked the energy for indignation. "Connor and I have a complicated relationship." "Most family relationships are," Eleanor said simply. "We've never been close, even before his mother and I divorced." Maxwell swallowed his pills methodically. He was always closer to Victoria. "After the divorce, I buried myself in work. It was easier than dealing with everything else." Eleanor sat in the chair across from his desk, something she'd never done before her promotion but now felt natural. "May I speak frankly, Mr. Bennett?" Maxwell gestured for her to continue, curious. "You're running out of time to fix what's broken between you and your son." The bluntness of her statement hit Maxwell like a physical blow. No one in his orbit had dared speak to him so directly, in years. Yet coming from Eleanor, he found he couldn't dismiss it as easily as he might have from someone else. "What if it can't be fixed?" he asked after a long pause. "Then at least you'll have tried." She stood, gathering the empty water. "Glass? But you won't know until you make the effort." That night, Maxwell lay awake. Eleanor's words echoing in his mind. She was right, of course. The precious time he had left was slipping away while he maintained the emotional distance that had defined his relationship with Connor for years. Next morning he called his son directly rather than texting. "Dad?" Connor sounded surprised. "Is everything okay?" "Yes, fine," Maxwell replied, struck by how his son's first assumption was that something must be wrong for his father to call. "About dinner tonight. My schedule cleared up. I'd like to see you, if you're still available." There was a pause. Before Connor answered, "Yeah, sure, the usual place at 7. "Actually," Maxwell said, "I was thinking you might come to the house. Eleanor's an excellent cook, more private than a restaurant." Another pause, longer this time. "Okay, that works." When Eleanor arrived that morning, Maxwell informed her of the dinner plans. If she was surprised by his change of heart, she didn't show it. Instead, she simply nodded and asked what he'd like her to prepare. "Whatever you think is best," Maxwell replied, realizing he had no idea what his son's food preferences were these days. "And would you join us? For dinner, I mean." This did surprise her. "Me? I don't think that would be appropriate." "Mr. Bennett. Perhaps not under normal circumstances," he acknowledged, "but I'd appreciate having you there." Eleanor studied him, sensing the vulnerability beneath the request. "May I ask why?" Maxwell hadn't fully examined his reasons until she asked. "Connor and we've never been good at talking to each other. You seem to have a gift for bridging difficult conversations." Eleanor considered this. "I'll prepare dinner for you both and serve it. If the conversation seems to need a bridge, I'll join you. Otherwise, I think this should be time for just the two of you." Maxwell nodded, grateful for her intuitive understanding of the delicate balance required. Connor arrived precisely at 7, in a sharp suit that reminded Maxwell uncannily of himself at that age. The resemblance had always been striking, the same strong jawline and intense blue eyes, though Connor had his mother's softer features around the mouth and brow. "The house looks the same," Connor remarked as Eleanor took his coat. "Some things never change," Maxwell replied, already feeling the familiar awkwardness descending between them. Eleanor served them aperitifs in the living room, a space Maxwell rarely used despite its elegant design. As she moved efficiently around them, Maxwell noticed Connor watching her with curious interest. "How long have you worked for my father?" Connor asked her directly. 6 years now," Eleanor replied with a warm smile. "And recently promoted to personal assistant," Maxwell added. "Best decision I've made in years." Eleanor excused herself to finish dinner preparations, leaving father and son in a momentary silence. "You look different," Connor said suddenly. "Have you lost weight?" Maxwell waved away the observation. "New fitness regimen. Nothing dramatic. How are things at Meridian Capital? Still on track for that executive position?" The conversation slipped into familiar territory: work, markets, business strategy. Maxwell could feel Connor's shoulders relaxing as they discussed the subjects that had always been safe between them. By the time Eleanor called them to dinner, they were deep in conversation about an upcoming merger that both their firms had stakes in. The meal Eleanor had prepared was perfect: roast lamb with rosemary, a dish Maxwell vaguely remembered, Connor enjoying as a teenager. As they ate, the business talk gradually gave way to reminiscences, prompted subtly by Eleanor's occasional questions as she served each course. "Do you remember that sailing trip to Maine?" Connor asked, his expression softening with the memory. "Mom was so seasick, but you insisted we stay out until sunset." Maxwell nodded, the image vivid in his mind. "Victoria never forgave me for that. But the sky that evening, I've never seen anything like it since." "That was the summer before everything changed," Connor said quietly. "Before the company took off. Before you and Mom started fighting all the time." An uncomfortable silence fell. Eleanor, who had been unobtrusively clearing plates, caught Maxwell's eye. He gave a slight nod. "I've prepared coffee and dessert. In the study," she announced. "Would you like me to serve it there?" "Actually, Eleanor," Maxwell said, "why don't you join us? I think we could use a fresh perspective." Though clearly surprised, Connor didn't object. The three of them moved to the more intimate setting of Maxwell's study, where a fire had been lit in the fireplace, despite the mild autumn evening. As Eleanor poured coffee, Maxwell found himself studying his son's face, searching for traces of the boy he'd once been. When had they become strangers, and why had it taken the threat of imminent demise to make him notice? "Connor," Maxwell began, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "I owe you an apology." Connor looked up sharply, his coffee cup suspended halfway to his lips. "For what?" "For not being the father you deserved." Maxwell felt Eleanor's supportive presence beside him, giving him the courage to continue. "After your mother and I separated, I threw myself into building Bennett Enterprises. I told myself it was to secure your future, but the truth is, I was hiding. Business made sense to me in a way that being a single father didn't." Connor set his cup down carefully. "Dad, you don't have to—" "I do," Maxwell interrupted gently. "I've spent my life accumulating wealth and power, but I missed what really mattered. I missed you growing up. I missed knowing who you became." The silence that followed was heavy with decades of unspoken feelings. Eleanor remained perfectly still, her presence a calm anchor in the emotional current flowing between father and son. "Why now?" Connor finally asked. "Why are you telling me this now?" Maxwell glanced at Eleanor, who gave him a nearly imperceptible nod of encouragement. "Because I'm running out of time to say it," Maxwell admitted, his voice steady despite the weight of his words. "I have a brain tumor, Connor. It's aggressive, and the treatments aren't working as well as we'd hoped." Connor's face drained of color. "What? How long have you known?" "Few months. Dr. Harrison is handling my care." "And you didn't tell me?" Connor's voice rose, hurt and anger mingling. "All these dinners I've been trying to schedule, and you've been canceling because you're dying and couldn't be bothered to tell me?" Maxwell winced at his son's raw pain. "I was wrong not to tell you. I don't know what I thought. That I could handle it alone as I've handled everything else." "Except you're not handling it alone, are you?" Connor's gaze shifted to Eleanor. "She knows. Your housekeeper knows. But I don't." "That's not fair," Maxwell began. But Eleanor gently intervened. "Your father has been struggling with how to tell you," she said softly. "Not because he doesn't trust you or value you, but because he didn't want to burden you with his illness until he had to." Connor looked at her assessingly, then back at his father. "How bad is it? Really?" Maxwell sighed. "The original prognosis was a year. That's been revised. The treatments have been difficult and the tumor is growing despite them." "How long?" Connor's voice broke slightly on the question. "A few months, maybe less." The room fell silent, except for the soft crackling of the fire. Connor stood abruptly and walked to the window, his back to them. Maxwell exchanged a helpless glance with Eleanor, who nodded encouragingly. "I should go," she whispered, starting to rise. "No," Connor said without turning. "Please stay. I think my father needs you here." Eleanor settled back into her seat, touched by the young man's perceptiveness despite his own pain. Connor turned back to face them, his eyes red-rimmed, but his face composed. "What do you need from me, Dad? How can I help?" The simple offer, so direct and sincere, caught Maxwell off guard. He had expected anger, resentment, perhaps even indifference, but not this immediate shift to support. "I don't know," Maxwell admitted. "I haven't thought that far ahead." "Then we'll figure it out together," Connor said firmly. He returned to his seat, reaching across to place his hand over his father's, a gesture so unexpected that Maxwell felt his throat tighten with emotion. The conversation that followed lasted well into the night. They talked about treatment options, about arrangements that would need to be made, about regrets and missed opportunities. Eleanor remained with them, offering quiet insights and gentle redirections when the conversation stalled or grew too painful. At one point, Connor asked, "Why haven't you made this public?" The company will survive," Maxwell interrupted. "I've been gradually transitioning leadership to the executive team. No one needs to know the reason." "Always in control," Connor observed, but without bitterness. "Some things really don't change. As the evening drew to a close, Connor embraced his father before leaving, something he hadn't done in years. "I'll come by tomorrow," he promised. "We have a lot of time to make up for." After Connor left, Maxwell sat exhausted in his study, the emotional toll of the evening catching up with him. Eleanor brought him his evening medication and a glass of water. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything tonight." "You did well," she replied. "Both of you." Maxwell looked up at her, struck once again by the quiet strength she exuded. "I couldn't have done it without you, Eleanor. I'm beginning to think there are many things I couldn't do without you." The words hung between them, carrying more weight than either had expected. Eleanor's cheeks colored slightly, and she busied herself with straightening items on the desk. "It's late," she said finally. "You should rest. Tomorrow will be another difficult day." Maxwell nodded, but as she turned to leave, he caught her hand impulsively. She looked back at him, surprised. "Would you mind?" he began, then stopped, unsure how to express what he needed. "Would you sit with me for a while, just until the medication takes effect?" Eleanor hesitated only briefly before settling into the chair beside him. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the embers of the fire slowly fade, each lost in their own thoughts about the evening's revelations and the uncertain days ahead. In the soft glow of the dying fire, Maxwell felt something shift within him, a recognition that in Eleanor's steady presence he had found not just an efficient assistant or a compassionate caregiver, but something he had been missing his entire life. A true connection with another human being who saw him not for his wealth or power, but simply for himself. As winter settled over Boston, Maxwell's condition declined rapidly. The treatments had been discontinued. They were causing more suffering than benefit, Dr. Harrison had explained gently. Now it was about quality of life rather than extending it. Connor had become a constant presence, coming by the mansion almost daily. The awkwardness between father and son had gradually given way to a tentative but growing closeness. They spoke of business sometimes, but more often about memories, regrets, and hopes. Maxwell had even begun sharing stories from his own childhood, tales of struggle and determination that Connor had never heard before. Eleanor had seamlessly shifted roles once again, now functioning as both business proxy and home nurse. She managed Maxwell's increasingly limited work correspondence, oversaw his medical care, and coordinated with Connor on decisions that needed to be made. Through it all, she maintained her quiet dignity and compassion, becoming the steady center around which the Bennett household revolved. One snowy December evening, Maxwell sat in the conservatory, wrapped in blankets despite the warmth of the room. Through the glass ceiling, he could see snowflakes drifting down from the night sky, illuminated by strategically placed garden lights. Eleanor entered with a tray of tea and his evening medications. "Connor called," she said as she arranged the items on the table beside him. "His flight from Chicago was delayed due to the snow, but he should be here by morning." Maxwell nodded, watching her hands as she prepared his tea exactly as he liked it. "You've memorized how I take my tea," he observed. Eleanor smiled. 3 years ago you mentioned you preferred it with lemon and honey, no milk, just like your grandmother used to make it. You remember everything, don't you?" "Not everything, just the things that matter." Maxwell accepted the teacup from her, their fingers brushing briefly. These small moments of contact had become more frequent lately. A hand on his shoulder when he struggled to stand, fingers wrapped around his wrist to check his pulse, an arm around his waist when dizziness struck. Each touch felt significant, in a way Maxwell couldn't quite articulate. "Sit with me?" he asked, gesturing to the chair beside him. Eleanor settled into it, her own teacup cradled in her hands. They had developed a comfortable routine of sharing tea in the evenings, discussing the day's events, or sometimes simply sitting in companionable silence. "I've been thinking," Maxwell said after a while, "about what happens after." Eleanor remained quiet, giving him space to continue at his own pace. "The company will go to Connor, of course. He's ready for it now, I think. More balanced than I ever was." Maxwell sipped his tea carefully. "The foundation bearing your name is secure. The trust is ironclad. And I've made provisions for my staff, including a generous pension for you. Mr. Bennet. Maxwell, he interrupted gently. After all we've been through, I think you can call me by my name. She hesitated, then nodded. Maxwell, you don't need to worry about me. But I do, he said simply. I worry about what your life will be after I'm gone. Eleanor set her teacup down. I'll be fine. Thanks to your generosity, I'll be able to finish my degree. Maybe even pursue that teaching position I once dreamed of. You'll be an excellent professor, Maxwell said with certainty. Your students will be fortunate. They lapsed into silence again, watching the snow fall more heavily now, blanketing the gardens in white. Maxwell's breathing had become more labored in recent days, each breath a conscious effort. Eleanor was attuned to these changes, instantly, alert to any sign of distress. There's something else I wanted to discuss with you, Maxwell said finally, his voice quieter than before. Something I've been thinking about for a while now. Eleanor turned to him, her expression open and attentive. I've lived my entire adult life pursuing success, wealth, power, all the things I was taught to value. I've climbed to the top of every mountain I set my sights on. Maxwell paused, gathering his thoughts. But I've never truly experienced the one thing that most people take for granted. What's that? Real connection, intimacy, the kind that has nothing to do with achievement or status. He met her gaze directly. I've never allowed myself to be truly seen by another person. Not until you. Eleanor's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't look away. You've seen me at my worst, physically weak, emotionally broken. You've seen past the facade I've maintained for decades, and despite all that, you're still here. Maxwell's voice grew hoarse with emotion. It's the greatest gift anyone has ever given me. Maxwell, please let me finish, he said gently. I know what I'm about to ask is inappropriate on multiple levels. I know it. Crosses boundaries that should probably remain uncrossed. But if these past months have taught me anything, it's that life is too short for regrets. Eleanor sat perfectly still, her expression unreadable. I'm not asking for a dramatic declaration, or a fairy tale ending, Maxwell continued. I'm simply asking for one night where I can experience what it feels like to be with someone who sees me, truly sees me, not as Maxwell Bennet the businessman, not as a patient or an employer, but just as a man. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken thoughts. Outside, the snow continued to fall, creating a cocoon of white around the conservatory. You don't need to answer now, Maxwell said quietly, and if your answer is no, I'll respect that completely. Nothing will change regarding your position or our arrangement. Eleanor rose from her chair and walked to the glass wall, her back to him as she gazed out at the snow-covered garden. Maxwell watched her, already regretting having spoken. He had overstepped, misread the situation entirely. I'm sorry, he began. Please forget I've watched you for 6 years, Eleanor interrupted, still facing the window. I've seen you push people away, surround yourself with things instead of relationships. I've seen you miss your son's attempts to connect, dismiss people who genuinely cared about you. She turned to face him, her expression resolute. And over these past months, I've watched you finally open yourself to real human connection. I've seen you rebuild your relationship with Connor. I've seen you show kindness and generosity, not for business advantage, but simply because it was right. Eleanor moved back toward him, stopping directly in front of his chair. What you're asking for isn't about physical comfort or checking off some experience before you're gone. It's about allowing yourself to be completely vulnerable with another person, something you've avoided your entire life. Maxwell nodded slowly, struck by her insight. My answer is yes, Eleanor said softly. Not out of pity or obligation, but because I believe in the man you've become. The man you perhaps always were beneath all those layers of protection. Maxwell reached for her hand, overwhelmed by a rush of emotion he couldn't fully comprehend. Thank you, he whispered. Later that night, in the soft glow of firelight, Maxwell experienced something entirely new to him, the quiet intimacy of being truly known by another person. There were no grand passions or dramatic declarations, Just the gentle discovery of connection in its most authentic form. Eleanor's touch was tender, her presence a balm to the loneliness that had been his constant companion for decades. As they lay together afterward, Maxwell felt a sense of peace he hadn't known was possible. "What are you thinking?" Eleanor asked, her head resting on his shoulder. "That I've spent my life accumulating the wrong kind of wealth," Maxwell replied. "All those years chasing success, and I missed the most valuable thing of all. Which is this: connection, understanding." He brushed a strand of hair from her face. "I wish I'd learned that lesson sooner." Eleanor propped herself up on one elbow to look at him. "Maybe the lesson had to come exactly when it did. Maybe you weren't ready for it before." Maxwell considered this. "Perhaps you're right. I've never been good at accepting things I couldn't control. And now? Now I understand that some things are worth surrendering to." They talked through the night, not about business or illness or arrangements, but about dreams and regrets, about books Eleanor loved and places Maxwell had traveled, about childhood, memories and small pleasures. For the first time in his life, Maxwell found himself speaking without calculation or strategy, sharing thoughts he'd never voiced to another soul. When dawn broke, casting a pearly light through the bedroom windows, Maxwell watched as Eleanor slept beside him. In her face, relaxed in slumber, he saw not just the woman who had cared for him these past difficult months, but a complex individual with her own dreams and struggles, someone who had chosen to share herself with him despite all the reasons not to. He thought about the time he had left, now measured in weeks rather than months. There would be more pain, more indignity, more loss of control. But there would also be moments like this, moments of genuine connection that made the journey worthwhile. 2 weeks later, Connor arrived at the mansion to find his father considerably weaker but surprisingly at peace. Eleanor had prepared a light lunch which the three of them shared in Maxwell's bedroom, where he now spent most of his time. "The transition team at Bennett Enterprises is working well," Connor reported. "Everything's proceeding according to your plan." Maxwell nodded, though business matters interested him less and less these days. "And the foundation? Eleanor's foundation?" "The first scholarships will be awarded next fall," Connor confirmed. "The board is in place, the funding secured. It's a wonderful legacy, Dad." Eleanor, who had been quietly arranging Maxwell's medication, looked up with a soft smile. "It's going to change many lives." "Just as you've changed mine," Maxwell said, reaching for her hand. Connor observed this gesture with thoughtful interest. Over the past weeks, he had noticed the shift in his father's relationship with Eleanor. The way they communicated without words, the gentle intimacy in their interactions. Far from feeling threatened by their obvious closeness, Connor found himself grateful that his father had found such a connection in his final days. "I should go," Eleanor said, rising from her chair. "You two should have some time alone." After she left, Connor moved his chair closer to his father's bed. "She's remarkable," he observed. "Yes," Maxwell agreed simply. "I've never seen you like this with anyone. Not even Mom, if I'm being honest." Maxwell considered this. "Your mother and I loved each other once, but we were young and ambitious. We were building something together, a life, a family, eventually a business empire. But we never truly saw each other. And with Eleanor. With Eleanor, I'm seen for who I am. All of me. The successful businessman and the failing body, the achievements and the regrets." Maxwell's voice grew softer. "It's a gift I never expected, and certainly never deserved." Connor was silent for a moment. "Do you love her?" The question hung in the air, direct and unavoidable. Maxwell had never been one for emotional declarations, had always considered love a concept better suited to greeting cards than real life. Yet now, facing the end of his time, he found the word inadequate rather than excessive. "What I feel for Eleanor transcends any word I know," he finally replied. "She came into my life when I thought I had everything, only to show me how little I actually had that mattered. And now when I have almost nothing left, I find myself richer than I've ever been." The wisdom of this statement struck Connor deeply. He reached for his father's hand, a gesture that would have been unthinkable months ago but now felt natural. "I hope I don't have to wait until I'm dying to learn that lesson," Connor said quietly. "You won't," Maxwell assured him. "You're already wiser than I ever was." As January turned to February, Maxwell's decline accelerated. There were good days and bad days, but the trajectory was clear to everyone. Eleanor moved permanently into the mansion, sleeping in the room adjoining Maxwell's to be available whenever he needed her. Connor visited daily, often working from the home office to maximize his time with his father. The two had developed a ritual of watching old movies together in the evenings, films from Maxwell's childhood that he hadn't seen in decades. One particularly cold night, as a blizzard raged outside, Maxwell awoke from a fitful sleep to find Eleanor sitting beside his bed, reading by the soft light of a bedside lamp. "You should be sleeping," he murmured. She set her book aside immediately. "I wanted to be here if you needed anything." Maxwell patted the bed beside him, and she carefully sat on the edge, mindful of the tubes and monitors that had become a permanent fixture. "I had a dream," he told her, "about that garden in Vermont you described, the one your father planted. I could see it so clearly. The roses climbing the stone wall, the vegetable patch with tomatoes ripening in the sun." Eleanor smiled. "It was a beautiful garden. My father put his heart into it." "I'd like to think you'll have a garden like that someday," Maxwell said. "After all this." Eleanor took his hand, her thumb tracing gentle circles on his palm. "I will, and I'll plant lilies. White ones." "My favorite," Maxwell whispered, his eyes growing heavy again. "Yes, your favorite." As Maxwell drifted back to sleep, Eleanor remained beside him, holding his hand and watching the rise and fall of his chest. In the quiet of the night, surrounded by the trappings of wealth that had defined Maxwell's life, but ultimately meant nothing, she felt the profound truth of what they had found together, a connection that transcended conventional understanding, born in the most unlikely of circumstances. In his final days, Maxwell Bennett, once the most powerful businessman in Boston, found himself stripped of everything that had once defined him: his strength, his autonomy, his carefully constructed image. Yet in that vulnerability, he discovered what he had been searching for his entire life: the simple, profound experience of being truly known and loved, not for what he had achieved, but simply for who he was. When the end came, it was peaceful, with Connor on one side of his bed and Eleanor on the other. His last words were simple: "I never knew it could be like this." In the days following Maxwell's passing, as arrangements were made and notifications sent, Eleanor found herself the recipient of a letter delivered by Maxwell's attorney. Inside was a handwritten note in Maxwell's precise script. "Eleanor, by the time you read this, I will be gone. I want you to know that in these final months, you gave me something invaluable, the experience of true connection. For the first time in my life, I was seen not for what I had, but for who I was with all my flaws and limitations. You once told me that some lessons come exactly when we're ready to learn them. I believe you were right. My only regret is that I didn't learn this one sooner, but I am grateful beyond words that I learned it at all. The foundation bearing your name will continue your legacy of education and opportunity. My material possessions mean little now, but I hope you will accept the beach house in Nantucket as a place where you might plant that garden we spoke of. White lilies under a summer sky. I can picture it perfectly. Whatever path you choose, next, know that you changed me in ways I never thought possible. You taught me that true wealth lies not in what we accumulate, but in the connections we forge. With profound gratitude and love. Maxwell. 6 months later, Eleanor stood on the porch of the Nantucket beach house, watching as the gardener planted the last of the white lilies along the stone pathway. The ocean breeze carried the scent of salt and possibility, and in the distance she could see Connor's car approaching for his weekend visit. She had completed her degree, graduating with honors, and had accepted a teaching position at a small college beginning in the fall. The Eleanor Parker Educational Trust had awarded its first scholarships to 20 deserving students, many of whom would be the first in their families to attend college. As Connor pulled into the driveway, Eleanor thought about the unlikely journey that had brought her here, from housekeeper to confidant, from employee to something that defied simple definition. She thought about Maxwell and the transformation she had witnessed in him, from a man defined by power and possession to one who had learned in his final days what truly mattered. The foundation bearing her name would help countless students to achieve their dreams. The garden she was planting would bloom year after year, and the connection she had shared with Maxwell Bennett would remain a testament to the profound truth that it's never too late to discover what really matters in life, the genuine connections that make us truly wealthy. As Connor approached, with a warm smile, Eleanor welcomed him to the place that had become a sanctuary of peace and new beginnings. Together they walked toward the garden, where white lilies would soon bloom under the summer sky, just as Maxwell had pictured. Dear listeners, we hope Maxwell and Eleanor's journey has touched your heart as deeply as it has touched ours. Their story reminds us that true wealth isn't measured in material possessions, but in the connections we forge with others. For more emotionally captivating stories like this one, we've created a special playlist you can find by clicking to your left. If you enjoyed this tale of unexpected love and transformation, please subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Every day, we bring you unique stories that explore the complexity and beauty of human connection. Don't miss our upcoming content, and please